is far neater than mine is. Yours is far neater than what mine is.
I was just saying, yours is much neater.
I hope your travel went okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
we're holding it together, fighting the jet lag.
Doesn't look good.
Just a reminder for everybody, or to let you know, that we are live streaming this session. So just for your information, we were expecting, there was some roadworks going on outside, so hopefully that doesn't interrupt anything. But yeah, we are live streaming. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name's Charlotte Ainsley, and I work with FOSI as their UK and EU policy consultant. And today we're going to be doing a grand tour of worldwide online safety policy. Before we start, I'm just going to invite each of our panellists to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Letitia.
Hi everyone, my name is Leticia Avia. I'm a digital policy advisor, advising governments, organizations, companies in digital policy. I was a member of the French Parliament, drafted the law against online hate speech, and worked with the European Commission on the Digital Services Act.
Hello, my name is Julia Cook. I'm an international policy manager at Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator, and very recently the online safety regulator. I work in our international team with a lot of other colleagues worldwide on online safety to support global alignment with coherent regulation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Lisa Robinson. I work with the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, which is an international organisation. I work in the Science and Technology and Innovation Directorate, specifically in the Digital Economy Policy Division. And then within that, I work in the Digital Safety team. Great to be here today.
Thanks. Hi everyone, my name is Kelly Talon. I'm the Manager of Regulatory Policy and Strategy at the Australian E-Safety Commissioner's Office, which I realize is confusing given that my accent and Lisa's are switched. But very proudly representing the Australian government here today. And I'm really pleased to be here. So we are the Australia's national online safety regulator and educator.
Thank you, thank you. I'm sure you'll agree we've got some people from all across the world. So I know that some people have only just arrived, so including me. Well, I've been here a day, so excuse the jet lag. I'm sure you'll all be aware, but we've all been grappling with online safety policy regulation for a number of years. I've worked in this sphere for over 20 years, and we've gone on a huge journey in terms of legislation, and we do have some regulation now, which is, I'm fresh from London, so we have the Online Safety Act, which received royal assent just at the end of October. So we're going to hear today from across the world about some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, how the legislation and regulation has been implemented, and what we can do to drive that forward and how we can progress that, particularly in the US. We are throwing down the gauntlet to the US to develop their own policy legislation in the area. So we've got until around 12-ish for our panelists, and then we're going to invite some questions from you guys in the audience for our panelists. So before we start, I just wanted to ask each of my panelists what their day job looks like and what sorts of things they do. So I'll start with you, Kelly, this time. So tell us about some of the sorts of things that you do in your day job.
Sure, thank you. So as I said, I'm the Manager of Regulatory Policy and Strategy at the E-Safety Commissioner's Office. So basically, we are looking to implement sort of strategic implementation of a regulatory framework in order to make sure that the public policy goals underlying it are met. And part of that is reactive and part of it's a bit more proactive. So in the reactive space, there are parliamentary inquiries and consultations being held, it seems constantly.
Yeah.
So we're feeding into those through our experience and expertise in implementing the Online Safety Act and contributing to those discussions. So recently in Australia, we've had inquiries on feeding on the theme that's emerged this morning on generative AI
Yeah,
and its use
yeah.
in educational environments. And our Department of Industry, Science and Resources also looking at the sort of broader use of AI across Australia. And then in the more sort of proactive space, we are really wanting to make sure that we are future focused and agile and kind of ready for the emerging challenges that are coming up, including things like generative AI, but also looking at the effects of recommender systems and decentralization and other emerging issues on online safety and how they can create sort of benefits and challenges. So we also have a work stream that we call sort of tech trends and challenges, and we do some horizon scanning, and we speak to experts who are working in the area to try to develop up positions that help ready us to deal with those challenges.
Great, great. Thank you, Kelly. Lisa.
Sure, thanks. So, for those of you who might not know, the OECD, we are an organization that has 38 member countries. We also have some partnerships with, we have input from other stakeholders such as business and civil society and the internet community. So what the OECD does is we do work related to evidence gathering. We do work related to bringing different countries together to be able to, to be able to find consensus in relation to thorny issues such as the ones that we're talking about today. So my day job looks a little bit different probably to everybody else's on the panel. So we take more of a sort of a bird's eye view in relation to what's going on. We work with our member countries to understand in particular what different problems are. And then as a secretariat, we work at developing evidence bases and also helping countries from that evidence base to consider what sort of policy might be needed. And then we don't do that on a country-by-country basis. Part of sort of some of the OECD's reason for being really is that we can bring together the different countries and sort of give some guidance as to where policy might flow in the same direction from the same countries, from the same direction. And that then can help avoid problems such as regulatory fragmentation, which is really important in this space, where we have a lot of actors working across a lot of borders. And we also have damage and harm happening to people across borders. So we look at how we can sort of bring policy together.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
So at the international team where I work, a lot of my work is sort of in 3 different phases. The first would be sharing our approach with others, helping share our evidence base. So for example, at Ofcom, we have over 100 different pieces of research that we've done as defined projects. So a lot of the time we're happy to share that with others. There's no point duplicating it if somebody else has done it. So a large part is sharing our work and our approach with others, again, to support that regulatory alignment that Lisa's talked about. Equally, a second part of my job is bringing other people's expertise into our domestic policy teams. So we have over 350 people working on online safety domestically at Ofcom. So a lot of what I'm doing is actually bringing a lot of the expertise from other countries, and particularly, for example, eSafety's roadmap for age verification, sharing that with our internal teams to help develop our policy thinking and make sure we're abreast of other things going on. And then the third thing is probably setting up the structures to be able to share that in a strategic way. So we have the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, and we have other forums to make sure that we're sharing that coherently and consistently with as many people as possible.
Great, thank you. Letitia, thank you.
I will say, a different work when I am abroad and when I'm in Europe. I've been working the last year here in DC for the Center for American Progress, trying to explain what is European regulation and how it can benefit also for the safety of American citizens from American companies, tech companies. And then when I work in Europe, where we already have a regulation, I'm mostly working on making sure it is implemented, that we have the good resources, the good evidence, the good people, the good place, doing the good work. So all the work we've been doing in drafting the regulation also comes into action. And what I do also is a lot of advocacy. So this is what I'm doing right now here. So what I would do also on public media, writing articles, etc., to empower as much people as possible.
Thank you, thank you. Now, in terms of who's leading the way in online safety regulation, I don't want to cause any kind of bonfire here. Who do we say is leading our way? I know Australia were probably the first to have their act, but who else is kind of leading the way? We have the DSA, we have the Online Safety Act.
I would say Europe.
Yeah.
This is, but we can have a little debate, but I would definitely think that Europe has the most comprehensive masterpiece in terms of digital regulation. That is something that has been built to work for the next decade. And this is something that is very flexible. When we talk about the DSA, I like to say that it is like a recipe, but without all the ingredients, saying that the DSA is a regulation that tells the major elements that you need to have a safer internet space, but doesn't tell the tech companies you have to hire this number of moderators, for example. So they will do their own recipe, and then it has to be good.
Yeah.
And if the cake is not good, then the regulator will come and will say, okay, I want to have the detail of your recipe, and I will tell you how to change it. So this kind of flexibility makes it, I think, a bit stronger that other laws or regulation that we could have seen, even the one that I drafted in France that was too specific to be as efficient that we would have loved it to be. So that's why I will say Europe.
Julia, do you want to counteract that?
I think for us in the UK, what's really fantastic is that we're seeing there isn't just one approach. There are lots of different countries now bringing out this legislation, and for us that's really important because the harms don't stop at one border. So it's really encouraging that lots of different countries have things. We, as you mentioned, passed our legislation in October after quite a long time going through our parliament, so we were delighted to have that come through. And just there last week at Ofcom, we launched the first set of documents to start operationalising that. And I think the fact that we're able to work in forums like the Global Online Safety Regulators Network with people that have that legislation like e-safety, we're able to work together, learn from each other, and essentially meet the same aims. Everybody's looking to try and have a safer life online for our users. So the fact that we have those different approaches, it's just really encouraging that there isn't just one. It is happening across lots of different international borders. And similarly, I think in the UK, it's maybe, we often describe it as a regulatory cousin to the Digital Services Act. They're very similar. They have very similar aims and ideals to make that safer. And we use a lot of the same regulatory tools. We all use things like the risk assessments, transparency notices. As we've seen, e-safety use transparency notices as well. And it's really great to see that a lot of those regulatory tools are being deployed across different areas.
Yeah. What would you guys say were the drivers for regulation? Is it privacy? Is it child safety? Is it adult harms? What were some of the key drivers for the regulation to actually happen and come into force?
Myself or
Anybody? Yeah.
Why don't I take that from an international perspective? And thank you for not putting me in the position of voting a leader, because of my patriotic answer might have been Australia, but my diplomatic answer probably would have been very different. Look, I think that it kind of seems to the outsiders, or it seems to observers, that there's sort of a rush of legislation, and maybe this has come out of nowhere, but there certainly has been, certainly the Australian regulatory body has been in place for a long time. But at the international level, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of instruments and other agreements and guidance that have come along, certainly in the children's space. And that doesn't mean that there's not also a focus on online safety for adults or for other harms as well. But there has been for many years a lot of focus in relation to sort of how can we, at an international level, focus on online safety. So if the OECD has a recommendation on children in the digital environment, which I'm very happy to speak to anybody about here, if you want to grab me in the break, and as necessary, we can talk about it. But that recommendation calls for safety by design, and also puts a priority on safety as much as on sort of prioritising benefits. The Committee on the Rights of the Child also made a comment in relation to children in the digital environment. The Council of Europe has some guidelines. The ITU has guidelines. The World Economic Forum just recently released some guidelines. So it does feel like there's a rush of legislation, but there certainly has been a lot of conversation for a really long time about this. And I think the privacy and safety question is a really interesting one, in that because a lot of these harms are happening where the data regulator has been established for such a really long time. What we saw at the OECD when we did some research a few years back was that sort of the responsibility for regulating for safety was falling at the data regulator's foot, which is not necessarily where it should be. And so some of the moves that we're now seeing for online safety regulators is kind of, sort of meeting that need and that balance.
Yeah. Sorry, Kelly, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to hop in there if I could. I think it's all of the above as the drivers. I think we often talk about safety, privacy, and security as sort of the three legs of the stool of overall sort of online trust. I think what's really heartening, and I do think there are certain areas where you can get consensus and other areas where there is maybe less so. I think in children's online safety, their rights, their best interests, that's probably where you can get the most buy-in from the greatest number. So we did start originally in 2015 as the Children's E-Safety Commissioner with a remit that was specifically looking to address remediate harms around child online cyberbullying, and then also illegal and restricted content with a focus on child sexual exploitation material. As we began to implement that initial legislation, it became clear that online safety issues are not, restricted to children. They are certainly a really, really important component still. But we, over sort of a period of years, expanded our regulation and remit into different sort of areas, and now offer a couple of different schemes, including one for cyber abuse of adults who are experiencing really severe harm online as well. And I feel like I'm going to lose my thread. Oh, but you mentioned safety by design, which I wanted to come back to. So I think when we first started, the professions of security and online privacy are really well established. And when we first sort of started out, and we found ourselves kind of adding "and safety" to a bunch of documents and really trying to explain to people what we meant by the concept of safety by design. People had, in some cases, heard of privacy by design, but they didn't really always understand what we were speaking about when we were talking about safety and online harms generally. And I think we've been on a real journey over the past 8 years or so where we no longer, when we get a document for input, we're not finding ourselves having to add safety and safety by design, because it is increasingly sort of already in the lexicon, which is really great.
Yeah, absolutely,
Had one word, and it definitely goes in the same direction. If you look at the European regulation, it doesn't define what is online safety. Because we had 27 countries who had to agree on what is online safety, and we didn't even try to do that, because the focus will be different for each country. Some will think more about data privacy, some will think more about hate speech. That was mostly German people, for example. In France, we're more about terrorism, and we have some other countries who are more focused on child safety. But at the end of the day, when you look at the measures, what is really in the draft, in the law, it's the same thing, because we have the same means to address this. And then the focus of a country, the focus of the people is not the same, but what we have to do to address it is exactly the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is to be safe by design, to be transparent, to do risk assessment, and to take action, and to be accountable, because no regulation works if you don't have fines behind it.
Yeah. Julia, from the UK perspective, would you say there are different drivers, or are they common across the UK as well?
I'd say there's a lot of commonality there. For us, it is to make sure that UK users live a safer life online, and we have to prioritise where we start within operationalising the Online Safety Act, and we've started with the illegal harms. So some of the harms that are most distressing for users. Some of those are focused on children, so particularly around child sexual exploitation and abuse material, but there are also a lot that are around adults as well, so particularly around terrorism. So similar to what Letitia has mentioned, we then will have different phases. So in our second phase, we're going to be looking at a lot of the harms that are particularly difficult for children, things that might be legal, but still have that negative output on children. And then we have a third phase as well, which will be around user empowerment,
Yeah.
to help empower all users, whether they're adults and children. So they're the same drivers. We want to see the same outcomes. We want people to be able to have a rights respecting regime where they're able to, use their right to participation, have their freedom of expression online, whilst also having their right to privacy and balancing all of that with online safety. So I'd say a lot of the drivers are the same. We all want the internet to be somewhere people can, show up as their full authentic selves and feel safe doing that. But we are prioritising where we start in a very similar way.
Yeah. So lots of similarities and commonalities, but I would imagine for global industry, it's quite challenging to go into different markets and to not. There is a certain amount of fragmentation and meeting the regulatory and legislative frameworks in the country. Lisa, I don't know. I think you did some work around the fragmentation around this and what's happening internationally.
Certainly. So we did some work a few years back having a look at what the landscape looked for, like children online in general, so not in relation to harms necessarily, but in relation to what the legislation looked like and how different countries were responding, or what their laws look like in relation to protecting or meeting the needs for children online. And this is what led to the recommendation that we eventually developed, which is a soft law instrument which gives guidance to governments in relation to what policies they should put into place. And that's exactly what I mentioned before when we said we saw that a lot of sort of privacy data regulators, the responsibility was falling at their feet. At that stage, we saw a lot of regulatory fragmentation, a lot of siloed responsibilities. So data protection agencies might be responsible for something, criminal justice might be responsible for something.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we recommended was exactly a lot of what you're seeing now. So single oversight bodies, such as what you have an e-safety commissioner or an Ofcom, or what will come out under the DSA, which was putting together bodies that can coordinate responses. I think as we are seeing more online safety regulators come forward, we want to make sure that with these new laws that come forward, we don't end up in the same position where there's more fragmentation in relation to these laws. And that's where organisations like the OECD come in, where we can bring different countries together to talk in relation to these sorts of things. For example, we talked a little bit about safety by design, some of the work that we're doing now, which isn't finished, so I can't really give you any outcomes as yet, but we've recognised that a lot of international documents, all the ones I mentioned before, call for safety by design, such as countries such as Australia have safety by design in their laws. Other laws have safety by design elements, even if they might not call it that way. So what we're looking at is sort of, well, what does this mean, and how can we bring this together, and how can we give guidance which is useful for all stakeholders, so not just governments, but also industry and also children and their parents themselves, to sort of understand what's meant by this and how it can be implemented.
Yeah. So what would we say the major challenges are for regulation? That's a big question. I know, Letitia, I'll come to you first. What would you say the major challenges are?
I think it's not to be driven by the tech industry.
Mm-hmm.
The tech industry will, and I know there are some representative of tech industry here, and you will recognize your major discourse, that is to say, this is not possible, this is too many that you're asking us to do, etc., etc. But actually, you have all the resources to do it. You have the best engineers in the world. You have all the people who can find solutions to be safer. And what I found quite funny today is that I can see when people are trying, especially when it comes to generative AI, to be in this new market and to reassure people, because people are a bit scared about AI, and so they will say, see what we can do so that AI will be safe. I'm like, oh, wow, this is wonderful. Why don't you do that on the social media that people are using on an everyday basis? Mm-hmm. That means you have the resources to do that. So I think the regulators really need to stick to what they strongly believe tech companies should do, and really stick to it, because the more you listen to the tech companies, the more you think they are the ones who have to implement it, and if they say it's not possible, let's try something lesser and lesser and lesser, and at the end of the day, you have nothing.
Okay, Julia.
There definitely is a challenge with the fact that these harms are global and a lot of the companies are global.
Yeah.
So as you've alluded to, we need to make sure that it's balanced and proportionate, and as far as possible that our regulation is coherent and clear across jurisdictions. If it aids compliance, that creates better outcomes for the users and creates that safer environment. So it is a really key outcome. But we do recognise it is a challenge. Certainly at Ofcom, one of the things that we have done very recently is publish our consultation document for illegal harms. It includes lots of different mitigations that organisations can put in place, but they don't have to. It's very much a technology neutral, and it's an outcome focused approach. So if they want to take a different approach that they think is better, they're able to, but they do have to still demonstrate why that approach works, why that helps prevent the harms that might be otherwise happening on their platforms. So it's trying to strike that balance between giving organisations the space to be innovative, to come up with their own solutions when they know their company's best, but also supporting those organisations that might be smaller. So in the UK, the Online Safety Act is likely to impact over 100,000 organisations. Not all of those are going to be huge multinational companies.
Yeah.
So we've really tried to balance having very detailed guidance with things that are accessible and digestible, and that some of those smaller companies are also able to implement. So it's meeting those different challenges. I think for us as regulators, a big challenge is making sure we are speaking to one another. It's a great opportunity to make sure we are being coherent, we are supporting those things. And I think the fact that so many of us have the same regulatory tools, like those risk assessments and transparency notices, it helps to share that, and those are great opportunities to meet some of those challenges.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't disagree with my friends on the panel, and I think Julia kind of beat the OECD drum a little bit for me already in relation to cooperation across countries and cooperation across regulators. Perhaps so as to not labour that same point, a challenge also is making sure that we have good evidence for what we're doing, for what laws are put in place, what policies are put in place. And it really is a challenge in this space. I mean, we've spoken already this morning about generative AI. I was here at this conference last year. I don't think we had any conversation about possibly AI at all. Or if we did, it was not anywhere near the same as what the conversation we've had today, or the conversations we've all had in the last year or last few months. So challenge is going to be keep getting evidence and getting that evidence in place so that policies can be fit for purpose, and making policies which are based on evidence but which are also future-proofed, and don't rely on different technologies or don't respond to particular technologies, because as we've seen in the last 12 months, a new technology, well, not new, but a technology can go to the forefront like that and get everyone's attention with a lot of risks. And there's a risk that the policy response might be knee-jerked and not based on evidence, and so I think that's a really big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'll jump on that future-proofing point, and just I think generally regulation always lags behind technological development, which makes it difficult. The process of developing legislation and getting it passed takes a long time often. Then there's the process of actually implementing it, getting all the relevant instruments and guidance set up. And by the time that happens, things have moved quite quickly in the interim. So having that sort of technologically neutral approach, making sure that you're sort of continually doing that horizon scanning and you're prepared to deal with the next challenge as it emerges. There are some really sort of forward-leaning aspects to the Online Safety Act. We were really fortunate that the idea of sort of, years ago, computer-generated imagery falling within the definitions was contemplated, both for child sexual exploitation, but once our image-based abuse laws about the non-consensual distribution of intimate images came into effect, those contemplated the issue of deepfakes.
Yeah.
So we're sort of relatively well set up to deal with some of the new and emerging synthetic material, even though we didn't necessarily know that synthetic material was going to be so indistinguishable from natural content.
Yeah.
but we can't future-proof against everything. And so setting up sort of other approaches that can underlie the regulatory response, and we've already spoken a couple of times about safety by design, but that initiative for us is largely a voluntary one to try to get industry to proactively think about safety at the outset, and we deliver a whole range of guidance which isn't meant to be sort of really specific to any particular type of platform or technology or issue, but rather to get people thinking more broadly about what might the risks be and how might they tailor solutions to their particular platform. And so having that as the sort of foundation, which can really easily be tweaked much more so than a legislative response can, and then layering on those other responses on top of that, which add sort of additional kind of regulatory teeth to that if that doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a small thing, just to talk a bit for my friends regulators. I think the regulators needs resources. They need major resources, financial resources, human resources, brains, and people who do research who can go work for the regulators. I know that working for tech companies is very, very attractive, and there are all these conditions that people really jump into it and say, I'm going to work with these big teams and have all these resources, but this is major work that is done by the regulators, and they need people committed to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kelly, given you're the Australian rep who've had the longest time to kind of have the regulation, implement the regulation, what would you say the major barriers have been? What kind of things have kind of got in the way, and how did you overcome them? What advice would you give?
I think it's difficult being a small country with this legislation that purports to sort of regulate the internet at large. So it's really helpful to have friends coming online, to be working together through forums like the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, to be information sharing and learning from one another. It is just incredibly huge. I think another piece has been the sort of information asymmetry that we've seen, and Julia's mentioned a couple of times, transparency being a common element of a lot of the different regulations. So really now starting to see there's been a lot of voluntary transparency efforts over the years. Some of those have been wonderful and have brought together multi-stakeholder audiences to kind of really drill into what is transparency and why do we need it to hold companies accountable and to make change. But there has in some cases been limited uptake of those voluntary initiatives.
Yes.
So now being able to back those up with notices that are enforceable. And we've exercised 13 of those notices to date under our regime. Really excited to see the reporting start under the DSA, really excited to see what's going to be coming out of Ofcom as well. And the more information that we can get about what's actually happening, the better informed the debate can be, and the more we can really hold people accountable for online safety.
Absolutely.
I might just jump on that to mention that, back to the evidence base, that we also, the OECD has also done some research in relation to transparency reporting, just to flow on from what Kelly said. And we've looked at both terrorist and violent extremist content and the transparency reporting practices of looking at the top 50 online content sharing services for TVEC, and we've just recently released a report which looks at child sexual exploitation and abuse. And I kind of echo more what Kelly said from our research, which has looked at what has been to date, other than the Australians initiative and what has sort of just started coming under the DSA, voluntary practices. Our research has seen that of the 50 companies that we looked at for child sexual exploitation and abuse, only 20 of those issued a transparency report, and of those 20, they all did it differently. And so I think for policymakers as well, that's a big concern. Even under the DSA, as I understand it, some of the reports that have recently come out, even though the reports have to be made, again, there's the same issues coming through with different metrics, different issues being measured. So it's still difficult for policymakers and researchers to really understand what's happening on each platform and to get a comparable evidence base. And so that's why we've done that research, and we will continue to do it. So,
yeah. Julia, what about from an Ofcom perspective? I know you're at the beginning of the journey, but what's next?
A lot of work is probably the short answer to that. This is where the work begins for Ofcom in many ways. We've been preparing for this for a very long time, and we've over 20 years of experience regulating communications, with a couple of years as well in that of the video sharing platform regime. So we've learned a lot. For example, with transparency, we published a paper last year around the different things that transparency can tell you. So for example, if somebody's metric for the number of complaints goes up, does that actually mean their service got worse and that there was more harm happening, or does that mean their complaints process got better and more people understand how to use it? So there are different elements behind the transparency that I think it's great to be able to cooperate and learn from others and share our findings there. But I think for us the big what's next is bringing out everything to implement the Online Safety Act. So as I said, we have our first consultation out at the minute on illegal harms. We do invite everybody to have a read of that and to respond. With a caveat, it is over 1,000 pages, so maybe grab a cup of coffee. But we have accessible documents as well, which are a lot shorter and summarise it, because we're really keen to hear from industry, from stakeholders, from international community, from affected individuals about how this actually will come out. We want this to be something that builds on the evidence base that we have, but hears as many views as possible. So by all means, please check it out, and if anyone wants to discuss it, happy to do so afterwards. But that is just the first phase. When that closes, we'll be developing it to bring out then that consultation document as the code of practice, and it has things like a risk assessment guidance, it has illegal content judgment guidance to help support organisations. Then we have the second phase, that's looking at the protection of children, as I said. So we have to go through the same process of the draft consultation, getting responses, and then developing that, and then our third phase. And then after all of that's done, we have to regulate at that point. So we have to bring out a lot of guidance to help support organisations to comply. And then we have our supervision and our enforcement where it's needed. So we've been building our teams. We're ready to get started and get going with doing all of that. And we do look forward to engaging with as many people as possible. So that what next takes us into about 2025. So that's what's planned. And then at some stage after that, there might be a short holiday for a few colleagues that would be well deserved. But it's a continual process.
Great, thank you. And what about the DSA, Letitia?
We're having the first results of this regulation, and we're quite happy to see that things are going in a good direction. Nothing is perfect, obviously, but transparency is not just for transparency, but it's also to empower authorities to know better and to know what they can do better. As a member of parliament, I did thousands of hearings trying to know how moderation works, for example, for the big platforms, and I couldn't get any information. Now we know exactly that there are 52 people working on moderation worldwide in French for Twitter, for example. This is an information. You know that French-speaking countries are quite numerous in the world, and there are only 52 people working on that. We also had a very strong action regarding the war in Gaza, and a very, very fast answer from the Commission, the European Commission, to ask for tech companies to tell exactly what they are doing, and answers came back in a couple of days telling how many accounts were suspended, how many content were deleted, how many content were labeled. Definitely, you go on social media, you will see so many content that you should not see. But we are having data. We're asking also some research groups to do their own assessment, so then we can do the comparison with what the tech companies are telling, and then we can enter into an accountability process. So this is going in a good direction.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I've got a couple of questions left, and then I'm going to hand over to you guys. So I don't know if we've got any US policy people in the audience, but I'd just like to ask each of the panelists what advice they would give to the US around driving forward online safety policy. I don't know if anyone would like to volunteer going first, or I can pick on someone.
I can go.
Go on, Letitia, yeah.
Oh, the US, you have so much money. Use it. Use it. I think with the US resources and the willingness of Europe, we could just master all the digital space. So really, 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 you're so behind on that. And please, really use all the resources you have and just think that we're facing global harm. And this is global companies. This is not US companies. This is not patriotic companies. They are defending and this is what works in all industries. They are defending their own profit. They are not defending the country. So please, 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 just do not try to protect American companies as if they are protecting American citizens. This is what I would like to say to American regulators, policymakers. Yes.
Thank you.
I think from our perspective, seeing systems and processes is really a key driver. We highly encourage the adoption of any systems and processes that really give the responsibility to a platform to take that proactive approach. It's not just reactive, they need to be proactive to prevent some of that harm taking place. We would highly recommend any sort of systems and processes approach that looks at your risk assessments to proactively look at harm, that implements transparency to hold people to account, and that has that underpinning that it's not just voluntary, because when it's voluntary you will have some companies do fantastic things, they will do wonderful work, but not everybody will, and oftentimes then it's the companies that aren't doing that are seeing the problematic content. So making sure that there is a floor as well as that ceiling to aspire to break through. So having that sort of approach that is rights respecting. So again, coming back to balancing the right to privacy with the right to participation, right to freedom of expression, and that right to be your full self online and be safe doing it. So a rights respecting systems and processes approach is the big thing that we would be recommending.
Thank you, Julia. Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm not the best to answer this question, as I'm not coming from a lawmaker's perspective, but certainly it's not a wheel that necessarily needs to be reinvented. There's, as we've heard on this panel, there's other regulators, there's other countries that have put legislation in place. There are organizations like the OECD where everyone can come together, including US policymakers, and have these discussions and learn from compatriots and discuss about what the issues are, what the problems are and the thorny things. So I guess my very short message was it's not a wheel that needs to be reinvented, and I will let my lawmaking colleagues impart their wisdom as opposed to me.
And I think just adding on to what's already been said, we have a component of our Online Safety Act which is focused on systems and processes. We also have a component which is acting as a safety net for individuals who are experiencing various types of harm, and we can help remediate that harm, including through content takedown. And I know that with the First Amendment in the US, that's probably where some of the crux of the concern is when you have conversations about online regulation. But coming back to your point about learning, from implementation, we've been fortunate to benefit from really bipartisan and multi-partisan support on online safety issues in Australia. We do take a human rights-based approach. Every piece of legislation has to go through a human rights impact assessment. So the Online Safety Act, you can find the impact assessment alongside it. It looks at freedom of expression, at privacy, at the right to be protected from abuse and exploitation, at children's rights. And coming back to that idea of transparency, it's not just company transparency, it's government transparency. So we are compelled to produce an annual report every year.
Yeah.
There's certain metrics that we have to put in there. We're subject to freedom of information laws, so anybody can ask for information, and then there's limited exemptions to that, but otherwise documents are generally released to the public. And we are subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And so checks and balances can be built in, and you can learn from how it's been implemented in our country and other countries in terms of where you set that threshold so that you can both respect things like freedom of expression, but find the limitations of that around the right to be free from really serious forms of exploitation and abuse as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm going to pause there. Andrew has a mic at the back. If you could ask questions, I'm hoping you've all got some juicy questions to ask, and you could also introduce yourselves as well. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I don't mind. I can speak. Awesome. Hi, my name is Amanda Goharian. I work at Thorne. I work in research. So I was really excited to hear evidence being something that was highlighted. I'd love to hear specifically from a child safety lens when it comes to online regulation, what data you think is currently lacking that is a challenge or an inhibitor to moving policy forward?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay, thank you,
If you like.
Julia.
So
Thank you.
one of the key things, and it's a great question, and if there are any researchers, we'd love to chat about how to fill those gaps. But one of the things is actually the evaluating some of the mitigations that can go into place. So for example, if you put in place a parental control, if you put in place a measure that prevents children from speaking to strangers online, what is the outcome of that? What is the impact? Certainly for Ofcom, we have to be evidence-based. All of the mitigations that we suggest have to have evidence of how successful they are. And we definitely see in preparing a lot of our documents, certain areas have more evidence than others. So actually trying to make that a level playing field across any of the different things is really important. And trying to distinguish, although it can be very difficult, between causation and correlation. Is it because of one thing that's happening, or is it combined with others? Is it just happening conveniently there? That would be one thing. And then again, with media literacy, we would see the evaluation as something we're really keen to see more research and more evaluation done on media literacy initiatives. So
Yeah.
at Ofcom, we published an evaluation toolkit to try and help support practitioners with undertaking that. And it's something that then we're hoping can help the community with media literacy to use. But we're then really keen to see the evaluation and the research done to evaluate those different techniques. So certainly in the UK, that's one area that we'd be keen, and yeah, happy to connect after if that's useful.
Thank you.
I might add to
Ellie,
that as
yeah.
well. We one area that is a challenge for us, and I think for probably everybody, is finding out more about the lived experiences of younger children online.
Yeah.
The ethics process that you have to go through when you speak to children and young people about sometimes very serious issues is necessarily quite robust, because you
Yeah.
don't want to cause harm in doing the research. And we were fortunate, Julia mentioned our age verification roadmap, which was focused on the issue of children's access to online pornography. We managed to clear the ethics process to speak to 16 to 18-year-olds about their experiences of online pornography. It was a challenge getting through that process. And by the time we speak to a 16 or 18-year-old, they told us that on average their first encounter with that content was at age 13. So we're talking about things that happened 5 years ago. So being able to work hand in hand with really experienced child-focused researchers and try to find out more about what's happening for younger children, and being able to compare that, as we saw this morning, with what's happening in parents and carers, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe when it comes to European regulation, you will see that the DSA is quite poor when it comes to child online safety. It only has an incentive to do more risk assessment, because there is a real challenge today with this generation that is has a generative use of digital. We often speak about online harm, but there is a question of what is online harm if there is no online suffering. So the problem that we have now is to define for this generation that use so much digital, what is the harm that is caused by the digital, what are the consequences that are only from the digital, and then to determine what you can do to mitigate that. And that is a real challenge when you see how this is a full use of digital from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed.
Yeah, very difficult. We just have time for one more question, because we're the only thing that stands between you and lunch. So yeah.
So I'll be quick. Itai from Active Fence. I manage corporate development and regulatory affairs. With the question that was here around U.S. Regulation, do you expect that what we will be seeing in the coming years, similar to what we saw with GDPR, is that the de facto regulation for U.S. companies is going to be the DSA and maybe the online safety bill, because U.S. companies that want to have customers in those domains will have to adhere to that regulation? And if so, how do you see that impacting the regulation in states in the U.S. as well?
That's a great question.
I hope not for the GDPR because I don't think it's a great regulation. But I will say that we've seen, especially with generative AI, that the US is trying now to be more up to speed, I will say. And I think all tech companies can say that it is more expensive for them to just reserve the implementation of the DSA to the European continent and to make sure that some of the provisions of the DSA do not apply to American citizens. They are losing money doing that for some of the technical features. So the European laws will have a good effect of contamination on American law, I believe, and American practice anyway.
Yeah.
But there's still always this question of in the mind, we talk about that is this First Amendment. I would like just to say that the Bill of Rights in France is from 1789, and we protect freedom of speech. So it's our Bill of Rights, and there is no problem, there's no contradiction between safety and freedom of speech when you accept that there is no freedom to harm people.
Yeah. Anyone else like
Certainly from the UK, we do see that a lot of the companies that we engage with directly are global, and that they do have teams that work across the globe as well as just in the UK. And we know that when they're implementing some of the systems, it might then be that actually some of the protections that they're putting in place are implemented globally. And we see that actually with a lot of the regulatory alignment that we're able to support. Some of the things that they bring in Australia might be similar to in the UK, might be similar to in Singapore that also has an Online Safety Act. So we do see that it can have an effect extraterritorially, and that it can have that global impact. But we also want to make sure that any outcome is focused on the UK citizens for the work that we're doing. If companies choose to improve their protections globally, for us that makes more citizens safer online, that makes more people safe online. And actually it's about learning. It's not saying that we implement one solution everywhere. There are really great things coming out of lots of different countries, and it's about using the best bits off those to create the best experience possible.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yeah, look, I think I would just add that just because companies are global doesn't necessarily mean that a requirement in one country is necessarily going to be applied in the other. Even if they do put that in place in one country, it may not happen in the other. So I will continue to beat my drum about regulatory alignment and working together. And I wouldn't think that it can be relied on or could be assumed that just because companies will be following what the regulations are under the European laws, under the UK, under what's happening in Singapore, Ireland, what might happen in other countries as well. With the Australian law is that will then be the floor or the ceiling in the US or other countries without that regulation. So, I just will beat my regulatory cooperation and harmonisation drum again. So.
And on that same point again, I think observing how the legislation is implemented in other countries and the success stories that they have might be a form of inspiration here as well, where they choose not to sort of take on those protections in all jurisdictions. So one thing that we were quite inspired to see when we were doing our age verification roadmap work was around Ofcom and OnlyFans being based in the UK. And Ofcom has quite, good protections in place from the creator side in terms of age assurance and identity verification to try to prevent the issue of child sexual exploitation on its platform. However, in terms of fans coming onto the site and accessing some of the content, they didn't, at the start, have very robust age assurance protections at the outset, so the people encountering that content might have been quite young. And then through some of the regulatory interventions that we saw out of the UK, they actually applied much more stringent protections on the fan side. They didn't, as far as I know, choose to implement that worldwide, but now Australia is quite clearly looking at that as an example and sort of looking at, right, how can we make sure that those same protections are afforded to our citizens. So I think as we see the flow-on effects, if they aren't necessarily flowing onto other parts of the world, perhaps that can be a form of inspiration.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just very briefly add to that I think this is so important, because if we don't, otherwise we're going to end up with a situation where we will have unequal protection for children
Absolutely.
across different countries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We continue to bang the drum. Yes. Thank you. Please join me in giving our panellists a round of applause. so much. And lunch is served in the main area through there. And all of our guests are around all day if you want to try and catch people. Thank you.
We have a tight window for lunch too, so it'll be brought to you at your seats in the ballroom. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. That was really good. Yeah, it was really good. I think we could have gone on for longer.
Yes, definitely.
Always a great sign.
Yeah.
I guess we're back. Let's see how it goes.
We'll let you know.
Thank you.
It might also be the last thing you
Might. Okay. Everybody ready?
Yep. Let's rock and roll.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Bridget Todd. Welcome to the space. I meant to tell you that this is all being live streamed, so hope you're all cool with that. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. This panel is on speech, censorship, and scale, content moderation in 2023. My name is Bridget Todd, and I'm the host of 2 podcasts on technology and how it connects us, Mozilla's IRL podcast and iHeartRadio's There Are No Girls on the Internet. As we're all spending more and more time online, the space between the online world and the IRL world is shrinking. It's more important than ever that we can all show up online safely. It's a safety issue and also an equity issue. And navigating how we get there is complex, from free speech concerns to privacy to expression. It is a balancing act. Recently, the First Amendment has been used to challenge and halt multiple online safety laws across the United States. Meanwhile, in the UK and Europe have passed new safety laws that attempt to regulate the difficult space of harmful but legal online speech. Add in the proliferation of new AI systems, and there's a whole new challenge. While these issues may start online, they have real-world consequences. Content moderation has played a central role in global conflicts in 2023, with propaganda and real-world violence and survival stories from Europe, the Middle East, and the Global South competing for the world's attention. Content moderation reflects the values and priorities of companies, countries, and societies. It's a balancing act, something all of our panelists know very well. With that, I will introduce our panelists. Noam, let's start with you.
Hello, my name is Noam Schwartz, CEO of ActiveFence. We're working in the space of obviously trust and safety. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, back in the game. Cool. So my name is Noam Schwartz. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called ActiveFence, and we're working in the space of helping dating apps and gaming companies, social media companies, pretty much every company you can share on, tweet on, stream on, to protect their communities and from abusive content. Happy to be here.
Afternoon, everybody. Carl Szabo. I'm Vice President and General Counsel of NetChoice. We're a trade association that promotes free expression and free enterprise on the net. I also have a side gig where I'm a adjunct professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. And Noam, I'm really glad you're here, because if you can get the 12-year-olds who keep absolutely dominating me in Halo to stop reminding me of it, that would be really helpful.
Can you do that, Noam?
Let's see. Me and Mike can work together on that.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Ruan. I don't have a joke that good. Don't even know how to play Halo. But I am the director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a civil society organization that protects civil rights and civil liberties online. Look forward to the discussion.
And hi, everyone. I'm Mike. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Modulate, which is a company that works with game studios and other social platforms to help them up-level their safety game. Most recently, we partnered with Call of Duty to bring our AI-powered voice moderation to their platform. And I'll just say on the Halo front that I'm probably worse than you at Halo, even if you've never played before. So.
Well, Mike, let's start with you. And I have a question for you and then for all the panelists. I want to start by kind of looking back at where we've been. Given everything that has happened in the last 12 months, when it comes to the state of content moderation, how do you feel? Are you hopeful? Are you pessimistic? Where are you at?
I'm multifaceted. I think there's a lot to be hopeful and optimistic about. We pay a lot of close attention to what's happening in both sort of the social atmosphere as well as the regulatory space. And I think over the last year, there's been a lot of increased discussion across sort of all dimensions around the importance of effective content moderation, effective trust and safety, as well as the risks of those things. It's been really gratifying to see a lot more major entities really participating in a meaningful conversation, having the opportunity ourselves to speak with regulators, with individual members of industry, with end users, and really understand their perspectives around what it is that they're looking for from a platform. So I think compared to beginning of this year or a couple of years ago, there's definitely a lot more momentum for change. I think there's also still some challenges, still some things that need to be worked out in terms of defining what exactly it is that we're shooting for as we try to strike the balance between things like safety and privacy, which are not antagonists to each other, but do pull a little bit and have a healthy tension, and we need to make sure that we're able to navigate that stuff well. So I think we're moving in the direction of being able to have those conversations well, but those are conversations that have yet to be fully resolved.
The rest of the panel, I would love to hear your thoughts. When you think about content moderation, given everything that's happened in the last 12 months, how are you feeling about it?
I mean, one of the challenges with content moderation, I explain this to a lot of people, is it's time dependent, location dependent, attitude dependent. The simple example I often go with is if we were to have a policy of no nudity. Okay, that seems reasonable, right? No nudity. Well, the Statue of David then becomes illegal. Or you have the famous image of the Vietnamese girl running from napalm from Time magazine. So a lot of it is context dependent. I can tell you the four-letter profanity starting with an F can be very positive. It can be very negative. It can be somewhere in the middle. Once again, time dependent. So it's all, for lack of a phrase, relative. And that makes it really hard on the content moderation side because we can't come up with a single rule. It's not like people often say, well, you know, we have rules for speeding, right? 55 miles per hour. You can't go faster than 55 miles per hour. Why can't you say, well, you can't say this? Because it depends. That's the thing about free speech, and that's the challenge. But I am optimistic. I am really excited. One of my colleagues, Zach, over at NetChoice says, too often we end up just jumping straight from this is amazing, this is awesome, to this is the worst thing ever. It's something that we're all kind of suffering with. I think AI is a good example of that right now. But we can be excited, and the folks on this panel are part of that team who are looking at the situation and integrating technology, new ideas, new solutions to help make sure that the content moderation is appropriate for context, for time, and similar.
Oh, please.
Gonna be quick, but like something that I must say. I think I have some perspective about the evolution of trust and safety and content moderation in the last few years. I was a content moderator myself in 2008. And today, trust and safety is mainstream. Trust and safety, content moderation, what many of us are doing on our day-to-day jobs, people are talking about it all the time. It's in the media, it's in podcasts. People know what that means, and people also understand and respect how complicated it is, and also how frustrating it can be. And actually, I'm so optimistic because of that, because people understand that it's a challenge, and they don't expect that this thing would be solved immediately. And this gives a lot of, let's say, a lot of room for us to actually contribute and change things for the better. Because the easiest thing for haters is to say, well, you can solve that right now, so it's probably not worth solving, or it's impossible to solve. But we all know that things take time, and it is possible to solve it. And this is why I'm optimistic. This is why I'm optimistic, because I'm seeing people are actually acknowledging that.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, I share a lot of the optimism that I've heard. To make points, a couple points about equity. You know, Carl pointed out that content moderation is context specific. One of the most important contexts is language, and we do a really, really, really kind of good job in English, but other languages less so. We also do a really good job moderating content when it is, you know, spoken by the majority, spoken by people that are part of the mainstream, and less of a good job when we're talking about people who have marginalized identities. But I'm optimistic because we get that. You know, we understand that we're talking about it, we're thinking about it, we're talking to companies about it, we're talking to each other about it, we're researching it. And the more that we do that, the more we can plug into this iterative process and improve things for everybody across the board.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. It's like you're reading my mind, Kate. One of the things that comes up as a frustration, I think, is that nuance and that context. I have certainly had times where I know a content moderation team is not necessarily speaking my language online as a Black woman, and so they'll say, oh, this is not appropriate, but they might not understand the in-group conversation that's being had. And so I guess my question for all of you all is, how can we get to a place where there is more equity in terms of how this content is being moderated, so people aren't feeling like their speech or their expression is being policed by somebody who doesn't even speak the same language as they do? Obviously, I mean that in the sense of language, like they're speaking a different language literally, but also figuratively, where we might be speaking a different language culturally that you might not understand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's tough nut to crack, I'll say. And one of the things I know at NetChoice, we have several active lawsuits protecting the right of these businesses to engage in content moderation how they want. We've got them against red states, we've got them against blue states. Some want us to allow everything that's offensive on the planet. Some of us want us to remove everything that's offensive on the planet. What I take heart in is that, first of all, our Constitution protects the rights of anyone to say what they want to say on their private spaces, and then kick people out on their private spaces as well. But similarly, I think it is with businesses. I believe in businesses will figure it out, and they have. They start hiring people from all across the country, from all across different cultures, because they want to get it right. And they don't, I'm not going to say that they're the most philanthropic groups, but they do that because it's in their own self-interests. They want to make sure that when we go to their platform, or when they use their services, when I lose at Halo, that I don't hate the experience. I want to keep doing it. And you can only do that if you get it right. And if the content moderation is bad, and trust me, it's bad. I hear it all the time from people on the left and the right. They're like, I got thrown in Facebook jail. I'm just picking up Facebook. Because of something I said. I'm like, well, that's their right. But they're going to try to get it correct. And they do that by hiring people from all across the globe, from all across different cultures. And they are trying their best. And when they get it wrong, we need to let them know so that they can have even more incentive to get it right next time.
I'm going to be mildly pedantic here and say it's not so much correct because, as we've called out, there's not really one correct for this, but it's consistent and transparent. And Bridget, you were talking about how do we do this well, but then you were also hinting at how do we build trust with end users that we're doing it well. I think a really key part of that is being really transparent with end users around what kind of space is this supposed to be. Maybe you have a belief that you should be allowed to have all these really detailed, sort of potentially toxic conversations, and the platform just doesn't care to be the specific venue for you to have that conversation. That's okay. It's fine for different platforms and different people to have different perspectives on it. But without that transparency, you end up having all these clashes where people come in expecting one thing or demanding one thing, treating others under those assumptions, and that's where you really run into the issues. Really briefly on the technically sort of how do we solve this as well, I'll say the way we think about it at Modulate is trying to move away from the sort of terminology of content moderation and think of it more as harm moderation. What we're looking for is not, did you say the F word, to take that example from earlier. We're looking at, are there indications in this conversation that someone is being harmed? And especially in voice, you can look at that from a lot of angles. You can see what people are saying. You can see the emotion of how they're saying it or how other people are responding. You can even look at behavioral cues. So a new person joins the conversation, says one sentence, and everyone suddenly goes quiet for 30 seconds. You don't need to know what the person said to know something bad just happened.
The record scratch.
Right? So being able to put all those puzzle pieces together gives us much more ability to say, hey, let's actually, protect people who are having bad experiences on the platform rather than mandating exactly how you need to interact with each other or what words you're allowed to use.
Is this something that you feel is possible to do at scale? Like you're saying all the things that I love to hear, but I'm sure there are folks in high-level decision-making positions who are like, but we could never have that be something that works for every user. Do you think that's possible?
There's two big caveats. One is that we have a bit of an advantage with voice because it's so multidimensional. You get the emotion, you get things like pauses, you get whether people are interrupting or speaking over each other. Something like text or images, you're going to have different kinds of sort of metadata to be looking at that may be more difficult to get that kind of complete picture of the story of what's happening. So we can do this really robustly in voice. It is a fundamentally different story from other media types. The other challenge is that there are some types of harms that don't harm a specific person there in the conversation. So the process I described is great for detecting things like hate speech. But if you're trying to detect, hey, is there a group of white supremacists plotting something in the real world? No one there in the conversation is feeling or experiencing or exhibiting signs of being harmed by the conversation itself. So for certain kinds of harms like that, you do need to sort of fall back to content a little bit, and you can still do it in a very rich context-aware way, but that's where those kinds of approaches get harder. But with those two caveats, yes, you can do this robustly at scale, and it's something that we and some other companies are already doing robustly at scale.
Go ahead.
So there's a few ways to also do it at scale, and it comes from a few kind of like more original ways to do it. So first one is to actually do the research and understand beyond your immediate target audience. And everybody's biased. Like you can't go around it. This is part of life. This is part of being human. But how do you over-engineer so your team won't be biased, that your company won't be biased, your policy won't be biased, and actually spending the time, the resources to figure out what you're not seeing and implementing that and almost forcefully bringing that into the discussion, into the policy making, which is a very hard process, as you know, is a major thing of that. Another thing that is not really discussed a lot, and I think it's pretty innovative, and some companies, especially in the gaming space, are doing that today, is understanding what's causing the positive engagement, the actual good things. Because it's very easy to recognize, not easy, I'm sorry, but we know how to do it, how to recognize the bad experiences. Like Mike said, that everybody's now like shutting up for 30 seconds. Oh my God, what did they say? But what is the kind of speech, what is the kind of experience that makes everybody get more points and buy more virtual goods or whatever you'll define as a positive engagement. And actually learning from that, training algorithms based on that is also something that can really help broaden the discussion, in my opinion.
One of the other, first of all, I love the idea for Modern Warfare 2. If people give you thumbs up, you should get like an auto up rank. I think there you go, reinforce the good news. But we also need to look at the way that it's done, because content moderation is not universal in the way that it's done. Most of us always think of kind of this top-down command and control, because that's what several of the major platforms do. They set their rules at the top, and they're the ones who activate whether content is removed or kept. There are other platforms, I like to pick on Reddit for an example of this. This is user moderation. So if you go into any subreddit, the removal, the content moderation, whether you're following the rules, they are done by user moderators. So that's another way that we can do stuff at scale, is leveraging and harnessing the actual people on the platform. Now also the big guys do it as well. If you see bad stuff, you can flag it, you can notify it for the content moderators, you can up-like stuff that you use. And let's also remember, that is a form of the content moderation that is being done. And then to take it back to where Stephen started this whole day with AI, of course, being the alpha and omega of all conversations in DC these days, that can also be a really useful tool, because we've been using it for 20 years in content moderation decisions when it comes to spam, right? Spam emails are essentially AI content moderation. Does this email make it to your inbox, yes or no? And you can't get around it just by changing a word here or there, because if so, spam blockers wouldn't work. So we do that. We do that with SEO optimization. So I think that's where also artificial intelligence, for whatever you want to define that as today, can actually be another tool to do this at scale. And it learns by how we engage with it. Because if you get that 30-second pause, it'll figure out, wait a minute, something's up, dog, and then they'll address it.
That's a great pivot. We talked a bit about this on the prep call, AI. How do you see AI is impacting these conversations around content moderation? This is an open question for anybody.
changes everything. Really, like it makes it from like, let's say it makes it more accessible. Like right now, there's like a lot of like great APIs that can do generic content moderation. So people that didn't do anything are doing something, which is positive, right? However, it's also crystallized how important it is to be expert in one topic that you really want to cover. If you're taking seriously CSAM or human trafficking or topics that are close to our heart right now, you can't really wing it with AI, like just random AI, like out of the box. So this is why it's also dangerous to rely just on things that we're seeing right now. Another angle is the content that is being created. The conversation around AI is very convoluted, and it's very important that we won't mix the discussions of people from general intelligence and like the Matrix is here, Terminator is here, than to the risk of disinformation, hate speech. What's actually is happening right now, as we all saw, like in all kinds of demos that were circulating in the last few weeks and months, that is actually harmful. And when we're focusing on that, let's solve this problem one at a time and actually try to work with the foundation models and help them solve that problem that they're offering the public. I think we can actually make real progress in helping AI be safe.
So, go ahead.
Me? Okay. I think, first things first, they're going to use it. Companies are going to use it. And so, what are, and like CDT has done a lot of research into this, and the questions that we ask are, what do they use it for? What are its capabilities? What are its limitations? How do we mitigate those? I think all of those questions need to be asked before implementing these types of tools. And I think that the limitations are probably the thing that we sort of allied the most in these conversations, because it's like, this is like magic. This is so cool. It can automatically identify all of these things, except, when you're talking about things like hate speech or terrorist content or even child sexual abuse, to the extent that it's not child sexual abuse material, which is like a known image in the world. We are talking about speech that is difficult to define. The AI needs a definition. And it needs a concrete definition in order to be able to identify what is or isn't in scope of a particular rule. And that definition, whatever it is going to be both over and under inclusive. It's going to include things that are not that should not be included in the definition of hate speech. It's going to exclude things that probably should be included, either because people get creative because they substitute words, or it just does not identify a particular new context in which hate speech is occurring, for example. The other piece that we should put on this is like, what is the AI being used for? Is it being used only to identify potentially rule-violating content, or is it also being used to take action against that content? Because one is different than the other, and one is potentially more concerning than the other. When you have an entirely automated moderation process, you increase your equity concerns even further, right? So to the extent we have over and under inclusiveness, those are both going to create and exacerbate equity concerns. When you then move to automating the entire moderation process, such that the AI makes a decision, and these are sophisticated enough that they don't just have to decide leave it up or take it down. They can decide other things too. They can decide down rank, they can decide promote. They can make those decisions. So those are all things that we need to consider. Companies are going to use this. What are the things that we can do to support their efforts? Like that this is going to happen. So how do we support civil liberties? How do we support equity? As we know companies are going to adopt these tools. I think to the extent that they're taking stuff out of the box, to the extent that we can help them customize off-the-shelf AI for their particular services, that can be really useful. And the other thing that we're going to keep needing is research, independent research that can be done that can be done in conjunction with the platforms, but not by the platforms themselves. Those are going to be really important things that happen as we continue to increase our reliance on AI in content moderation.
So
I'd love to add on to that last piece in particular. I mean, we've talked about AI for generating content. We've talked about AI for detecting content. You were just talking about AI for then making those decisions and the risks that come with that. I also want to kind of flip that around on the last piece, where when you're taking action on a piece of bad content today, most platforms will actually say basically nothing about why they're taking that action. They'll just take the action, or it'll be a very minimal piece of content. The platforms that have found ways, usually at high manual costs, to give real color back to the end user on here's what you did wrong, here's why this wasn't okay, have actually seen really massively positive impacts in that changing the behavior of their end users. But that's really difficult to do at scale. That's a really interesting application of AI technology, making those actions more positive and helping us move away from that mindset of everything's a ban or a mute or something like that, and into, okay, this conversation went badly, let's coach, let's support, let's help people find their way out of this bad equilibrium into better ways to interface with each other. I think study after study, continually shows of all of the sort of toxic content, at least in live conversations, whether it's in gaming or social chat, it's something like 5% of the people creating that bad content are actually trying to create bad content. 95% of the users are trying their best, and maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they snapped because they lost at Halo, maybe whatever it is, but they're not fundamentally trying to ruin other people's experience. They're just struggling, and that toxicity is emerging from it. And so the more that we can support and guide them, and I think AI is a tool that can help us do that, though like every tool, it needs to be used carefully and in a way where it's well understood.
I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to content moderation, what's the old adage, right? You can please all the people some of the time and some of the people all the time, but you never please all the people all the time. And unfortunately, that's the truth with content moderation. I'm constantly hearing from people all across the political spectrum about they took action against me because they hate me or they hate my policies. I'm like, that may be true, but at the end of the day, they're just trying to do their best job. And they're going to your point, they're going to get it right a lot of the time. They're going to get it wrong a couple, not so much, but you're going to hear a lot about the times you get it wrong. And I think that's an important one. Just to close the loop on AI real quickly, at NetChoice, I can tell you our policy is it is a tool. AI is a tool. As I mentioned, we've been using it for 20 years. Bad guys are going to use it. Good guys are going to use it. You can't outlaw it. I know we're here in DC where everyone rushes to regulate and control everything. Instead, what we are advocating for is you identify the gaps in the law where they need to be filled in. The one that comes to mind, because it was mentioned a moment ago, is child sexual abuse material. Today, CSAM, it requires an actual photo. So what we're seeing is bad actors are now using pictures of children on AI-generated bodies. And so that's an example of where you can do some gap filling where bad actors are using the letter of the law to escape the purpose of the law. And so that's kind of what I think is kind of the overarching approach when it comes to content moderation or AI is let's figure out what we're trying to stop and then move backwards, because we just had some really good points about do we want to encourage the good things or stop the bad things, and is there a way of doing both simultaneously?
If I can add one more thought on here, when we're talking about AI, I think it's worth reflecting on what's the alternative in terms of manual action or manual intervention. One obvious difference between those approaches is scale, but I think there's other subtler ones. Human moderators, no matter how hard you try to train them on consistent policies and set what you're doing, they are not going to behave in consistent ways because they're bringing in their own priors, their own understanding of the things. In a certain sense, that can be good. It means, hey, you're not going to have everything about your platform be definitively skewed in one way. It's harder to have that really explicit sort of failure of equity when you have a spread of human moderators. The downside is it's a lot less transparent because the actual enforcement policies are much harder to put into explicit words. And I'm not going to advocate one way or another, but I think it's an interesting question to reflect, would you rather have a platform that is trying really hard to be equitable using human moderators, but every once in a while some human moderator is just going to be confused or is going to be a bad hire and is going to be, pursuing some political agenda. There's this inherent ambiguity, but it's generally all directed towards trying to be as inclusive and respectful as possible. Or have a platform that just said flat out, here's the deal, we're banning the N-word. Yeah, we know that takes away a lot of authentic experiences of some people, but that's what we're going to do, and now you know, and now you can make an informed choice of whether you want to participate in that platform. That doesn't work at a societal level. If that's the truth of every platform, then we have a real problem. But if individual platforms land in different positions there, I do kind of wonder if it's worth thinking about that transparency being another way to achieve the equity that we're really looking for.
By the way, on that point, and not necessarily related to AI, but it's so important. What I'm seeing, and we're working with a lot of companies like social media, gaming, dating. One big problem, which is a real obstacle to, let's say, online safety, but also in real life safety, is basically not making a decision about a specific thing, and kind of like not wanting to get someone angry, and okay, we will see this one out. We'll see if the community will figure it out somehow, and usually they won't figure it out somehow, and then bad things happen, and then there's a news article, and then off to the next crisis. And this thing, basically, someone needs to be brave, make a decision. This is what we think. This is what's going to happen. If you don't like it, there's another platform, or there's another solution, there's another game. Because this will be like a never-ending of race to the bottom, like who makes the less decisions, and where we have less safety, and where more people getting hurt, which I think is a very, very important issue.
And I think it goes back to the point that Mike made about trust. It's hard to feel like you have the trust of the people making these decisions if decisions aren't being made. Or, in my opinion, it's worse if somebody makes a decision and then 6 months later they're like, well, the conversation has changed, so we're taking that decision back. And it makes it feel like, as a user, you have no control, let alone transparency, into how decisions get made. And so I think it really goes back to that point about how do you get people to trust that you're actually doing things in a way that they can understand and have some visibility into.
If anybody wants to try this at home, there's a video game. You can play it on your phone. Speaking of video games here, it's called Moderator Mayhem. It was created by a trade association called Engine. And literally, you take the place of a moderator, and you got your rule, and the things that get flagged just keep piling up, and they keep coming in. You got to make decisions, and then at the end of the day, they'll rate you, and you're making it based on the rule. And it's really stressful. And spoiler alert, you can't win. It's a
surprise, surprise.
Yeah, it's a Kobayashi Maru of a video game. But it's quite illustrative, the real challenges, because you can have these clear-cut rules, and they're really hard to apply, especially at scale. But I am optimistic. All the discussion we've had so far have been, how do we as users, how do we as businesses, how do we as third parties, how do we as developers create the tools to address this problem? One thing we have not looked to, and this is very encouraging to me, is we've not looked to the government to tell us what is or is not allowed on our platforms. Because keep in mind, for United States, First Amendment, everybody who's not from here, you can roll your eyes now. But that is wonderful to me, because I can quit a business that is not doing what I want it to do. We can hold them accountable. We cannot hold governments nearly as accountable. And that's the thing that I find very encouraging. And I've got a bunch of smart people back in my office, locked in a legal department dungeon, working on lawsuits and briefs that we're filing to uphold the values, to make sure the government's not the one setting the rules as to what we can and cannot say, but instead we, the people, the users, the businesses, get to make those decisions. So that's been really encouraging for me on this panel.
Well, just to harp on top of that on my favorite peg of transparency again, like where should government be involved? I would argue that that's where that regulation can be really powerful, where it pushes for more transparency so people can make that informed choice to vote with their feet. I think if we don't have that, then to Bridget's point, you just have people having various different experiences, and it's really hard to say, do I actually respect the way this platform is approaching things? But if we have that regulated transparency and people can actually make really meaningful, informed choices, then I agree that allows us to hold that private industry accountable in a much more rich way.
Yeah, Noam and Kate, I'm curious, what role do you think government should have in all of this?
That's a big one, and I think we were discussing this thing for a very long time, and kind of like connecting it to what I said before, where platforms are unable to make a decision. So sometimes, kind of like setting ground rules should be made, and we're seeing this with, let's say, with CSAM. Like if you have like a platform, and I think yesterday I saw a post from the E-Safety Commission about one of the platforms basically getting shut down because they were not able to deal with CSAM. And I think this is a good thing. Eventually, if a platform cannot comply with what society thinks is a basic rule, it should actually put their foot down. And eventually, we need to minimize where the government actually intervene. But sometimes there are places where the industry can't make a decision, and eventually the people need to make a decision for their own.
That platform was Omegle, by the way.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to pronounce it.
I might have gotten it wrong.
I mean, one of the challenges there, though, and so child sexual abuse material, I'm not going to fully put on my lawyer hat, isn't considered fully protected by the First Amendment. It's this other space. But simultaneously, we can't lay all the blame at the platforms because, what was it, the AG, the Attorney General, the lead chief enforcer of the state of Utah said, well, we can only take action on 30% of the instances of CSAM that get reported to us. And to me, as a parent, I'm like, are you kidding me? 7 out of every 10 instances of child sexual abuse material goes in the shredder in the state of Utah. And you're blaming the platforms for your inability to enforce the laws. So simultaneously, yes, platforms need to do reporting. They do a ton of reporting. We've done reports on that. I see Maureen Flatley from Stop Child Predators in the back as well. Like, they do great work on this. But that needs to go hand in hand with putting the criminals in prison. And like, you can't say platforms got to do it all, because guess what? We can put you in Facebook jail. We can't put you in real jail. And it's kind of more the latter that matters. So yeah, when it comes to stuff like CSAM, absolutely throw the book at them. Platforms can and always are doing more. But simultaneously, we need hand in glove with law enforcement to actually kick in doors and put those people in prison. Sorry, that's my rant. I apologize.
It's a good rant, I'm not going to lie. Especially, Ron Wyden has a bill for that.
Yes, I know. We very much like it. So.
Yeah. I mean, CSAM aside, I would say, I'm a U.S. First Amendment lawyer. I apologize to everybody for that.
Yeah.
Apologetic lawyers on this panel.
Carl and I are alone. So, I have, and I also worked for the ACLU, so I have a very deep skepticism of government involvement or government decision-making related to what people can or cannot say anywhere, the internet, my house, out on the street. I have a deep skepticism of that. I also have skepticism of policies that would allow the government to put pressure on platforms to make them say what they want to say or ban what they want to ban, and that can, some transparency legislation can actually be a Trojan horse for that sort of thing. All of that said, that's my First Amendment spiel. I have deep skepticism of government involvement in content. That being said, DSA exists. The DSA exists, and it is going to have profound effects on content online. And I think those of us in the United States with an eye on it, like a lot of the concerns, a lot of the things that like I have spent my career fighting against here, like no notice in action, no auditing of like speech-related decisions. How can you possibly measure what what a systemic risk is when the systemic risk is gender-based violence in the world. I don't know how you do any of that. And so I've spent a lot of time in the US being like, you cannot do that. You can't, like, government cannot do this under the First Amendment. And that's probably true here, but it's happening there. It's happening in the EU, and we need to pay attention to what is going on there, because it is going to happen here too, because we've been talking a lot about scale. And so even though a lot of these things only apply in the EU, some of the practices that especially the global platforms come up with that they're going to implement under the DSA are going to happen here too. And so we need to be aware of that. Like, so what I guess what I'm saying is, to some extent, what I think the government involvement in content moderation should or shouldn't be doesn't matter, even though I wish it did. It's already happening. We are already seeing governments involving themselves in content moderation. In the EU, we got some good safeguards, but there are also some significant concerns. The biggest concern to me is now we're seeing it everywhere else. You know, we see it in India. We see all of these all of these proposals from governments that you know, trend further and further authoritarian, that are going to fracture the internet. They're going to fracture content moderation. They're going to fracture the freedom of expression online. And so, like, how do we handle that? How do we wrap our brains around that? And how do we I don't. This is like the worst answer to this question ever. Because it's like, it is such a big issue that is, you know, kind of vectoring across different places around the world. And we in the U.S. we're holding back. We can continue to hold our principles, and goodness gracious knows I will. But I also have my eye elsewhere, and on how that's going to impact us, regardless of what we can or can't do here.
And I mean, I already partially answered this question with the transparency piece, but to what you're saying here, like, I think the other thing is, who can solve regulatory fracture? Probably no one. But if anyone, it's going to be government entities. Like, those are the entities that can play in that space and actually try and have a really meaningful impact on resolving some of that regulatory fracture and giving more clarity to the industry, hopefully moving in a direction that's really industry informed and really civil rights informed, and making sure that we're balancing all those considerations in an effective way. So I don't exactly know what that looks like, but given that we have the DSA, the UK Online Safety Act, the E-Safety Commission out in Australia, we have the Singapore Online Safety Bill, we have other bills, as you mentioned, in India and other places, something needs to bring all those things together into a consistent story for industry and platforms of what are we actually supposed to do? How do we actually straddle all of those different lines? And I would love to see, you know, increased engagement from all of those government players, as well as from the US, on finding some way to bridge that together into something more consistent and less fractured.
By the way, there's another thing to kind of a response to what folks said here. There's a governance asymmetry that eventually platforms are so much more powerful than any government, because the government can, you know, decide whatever they want, but eventually, you know, the head of policy in a given platform, no matter how small it is, you know, their decision goes in Singapore, their decision goes in India, their decision goes in the United States. So sometimes the responsibility is actually on them, maybe not from a legal perspective, but from a moral perspective. But regardless of that, we're actually seeing, and also about the DSA and other types of regulation, there is not about what is allowed and what is not. It's more about how do you do that, the procedures. It's like, for example, we are not allowing shadow banning, for an example, which is a good thing. This is let the user know that they did something wrong. It removes ambiguity from the process. I think it increases freedom of speech eventually. How do you deal with content? How fast do you deal? How do you appeal? How do you flag? You need to have trusted flaggers. You don't need to have trusted flaggers. Basically, I think that eventually the commonality would come from the process that will eventually trickle down to what is acceptable and what's not, because actually saying this is okay, this is not beyond system would be extremely difficult. And I actually see this thing is happening, and I'm well encouraged about that. And I definitely agree. DSA is going to be a major thing. GDPR changed everything for the internet, and DSA will also change everything. It's like this thing cannot be stopped anymore.
I mean, at the end of the day, so the U.S. just left the U.S., our USTR just left an international agreement. And for a long time, the United States has been that beacon on the hill of freedom and independence and similar for the world stage. I worry that just by saying, well, all of my friends are doing something silly, therefore I need to do something silly too, is the right response. As a parent, I would tell my kids, I did not raise you well, and we need to have a serious conversation. Likewise, I feel like I have to say the same thing to our own existing government of, just because the rest of the world is making decisions that curtail freedom and individual liberty and free speech does not mean we need to catch up to them. I would argue we are miles ahead of them, and we should encourage the rest of the world to allow people to be free, because I agree, a lot of these businesses are really big, but once upon a time, MySpace was very big, and it's not anymore. Once upon a time, Yahoo, a wonderful NetChoice member, was super huge, not so big anymore. And like all things, there is a cycle, and similarly, when it comes to governments loath to give up power once they have it. Businesses, once you decide you don't want to use their product anymore, they're going to suffer in their shareholders' values. You can ask Budweiser about that.
So I want to stop it there for a moment and ask what questions our audience has. Yeah. I think we have a mic in the audience.
I'm Maureen Flatley. Carl was kind enough. Carl was kind enough to mention my work a minute ago. I'm not a tech expert, but I've spent almost 40 years doing government reform and oversight of child welfare and child protection. And I have two observations to make. One is that while it may seem appealing to let the government make some of these decisions, I'm here to tell you that the government makes a lousy parent. And when you look at, I'll just use the Meta lawsuit as an example. When I went down the complaint of the main lawsuit and looked at all the states that were plaintiffs, alleging all these horrible things on the part of Meta's business practices, I almost had a stroke, because every one of those states has an appalling record when it comes to child welfare, their foster care systems, child fatalities, infant mortality, child literacy rates. So this whole discussion of the states being on the moral high ground and sort of pushing the tech industry around, to me, as an expert in child welfare, is ridiculous. The second thing, and Carl referenced this, is you can have the best platform in the world, but to have all of these companies, many of which I think are doing really fine work and trying to meet the moment, to be able to keep their platforms safe without, to Carl's point, engaging law enforcement is ludicrous. You have 39 million cyber tips last year, Caroline? The number of arrests and convictions, I'm the daughter of an FBI agent, so I'm always looking for outcomes in law enforcement. The number of arrests and convictions in the federal system was minuscule, 1,200 maybe, I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head. But as I said to Carl, it's sort of like the CVS in Columbia Heights getting shoplifted and having 50 shoplifters come in and steal everything in the store. Did anybody blame CVS for that? No, they called the police. And so as I look at this issue more deeply, there is absolutely no way that children will benefit as long as there's this emphasis on demonizing the tech industry, making the tech industry liable. By the way, the tech industry is a federally mandated reporter of any kind of misconduct with kids. Without the tech industry, there would be no cyber tips. In child welfare, mandated reporters are legally exempted from liability so that they will make the reports. So as I see this, there needs to be a much more deliberate and objective examination of what's going on in the real world, especially when the states and the government starts to come at you guys with all kinds of regulatory frameworks. I personally feel that the government needs to get out of this discussion and let the tech industry start to take it on with the help of law enforcement. You guys shouldn't be grading your own homework. You're not the police. And frankly, I believe that one of the reasons that the conviction rates are so low is that there's a problem with the evidence. And we need to understand kind of how that works and what that is. So anyway, just some food for thought.
I mean, one of the things that's also being left out of the conversation, and I completely agree with that, content moderation at scale, and this was alluded to in the study that was reported today, parents. Like, we're part of the problem/solution in and of ourselves. If we role model really well for our kids how to be decent human beings, look at what they do online, look at how they interact, then that will also help, you know, rising tide raises all boats. That's another avenue that's being missed. Now, there are steps being taken right now. Florida and Virginia took steps to include digital and social media education in schools. So that's a way that we can address content moderation at scale by just making people better, more decent to each other online, and realize you wouldn't say that to somebody in person. I mean, when you're in a car, you always honk a horn. When you're in line at the grocery store and the person in front of you can't operate the self-checkout, you're not walking up to them telling them you're an idiot. So that's the difference, is we need to begin integrating and meeting teenagers, students, and ourselves where we are, schools, clubs, stuff like that. And then that can also be another off-ramp as well.
And Carl, one last observation, and then I promise I'll stop talking. In child welfare, in the context of real-world child welfare, if you expose your child to something that's addictive or dangerous or violent, the caregiver is held responsible. So as I watch the congressional hearings that have been playing out lately, which are beyond mystifying, there is a completely different standard in the digital world. So suddenly, the guy the other day in the judiciary hearing was talking about how his 13-year-old was constantly barraged with sexual advances, and I'm like, excuse me.
That might be the timer telling us that we're out of time. I'm so sorry.
Why does she still have access to that device? And so the parenting issue, which I know is sensitive, is something we really need to look at.
Thank you so much for that comment. This has been such a robust discussion. I'm so sorry, but I'm getting the wrap it up side.
Questions for panelists after this, that is totally fine. We're going to have to move back into the main.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks so much to our panelists. And thanks to all of you for coming. There were more questions in the audience that we didn't get to, so please don't be shy. Come on up and ask your questions.